It's a real pleasure to be presenting this year's Affordability Report to you all. In our first webinar related to the Affordability Report, this is a new feature for us, so we're quite excited about it and to see how it goes. What we'll do is I'll do a brief presentation of the report's overall findings and some of the key points there. Then I can do a quick demonstration of our Data Explorer, which is online and allows you to see all the data and information that goes into the Affordability Report, and then we'll hand it over to Eleanor to moderate a question and answer session just to close out the webinar. But yes, so this year's Affordability Report is based around the theme of using market power to reach affordability and how these concepts of market competition and market composition within telecoms can help us drive down prices for internet and make it more affordable for everyone. Just to briefly introduce A4AI, if you don't know us, we are the world's broadest technology sector alliance, working to bring down that price of broadband, primarily focused in low and middle income countries. And we do that by transforming policy and regulatory frameworks. And that's a key part of where our work fits within this space. We do really focus on setting that environment that naturally allows broadband prices to drop kind of through that process. The Affordability Report itself is an annual effort. This publication is the 5th edition of the Affordability Report, and every year we track policy and regulatory progress towards affordable internet. And this includes at the heart of the report the ADI, or Affordability Drivers Index, which includes primary research from 61 countries from across the globe. But in addition, this year's report includes data of 100 of those low middle income countries in our broadband pricing database, and then also even some market data from other countries across the globe. Ultimately, this report is focused on trying to answer the question of why have some countries succeeded in improving internet access and affordability, and what can other countries do to catch up quickly? And this is really trying to speak to our message of trying to get universal and affordable access to every individual, no matter their circumstances. And so in this year's report, we did focus on this theme of market competition and how that relates into that vision of making the internet affordable. And so to go through the report, I wanted to focus on 4 specific parts, kind of listed here. It's first kind of how we understand broadband markets and how they work. Then it's how policymakers and regulators can support market competition. Then thinking about competition across the layers of the internet, not just in a more simplistic understanding. And then lastly, our research found that there is a really important role for public and universal access projects within this mission of reaching affordable access. If you get lost at any point along the presentation, there are the 4 tabs on the left-hand side that you'll see, which will indicate kind of which of the 4 topics we're covering at the moment. But it should be pretty quick and not too difficult to follow along. But first, we wanted to emphasize, why does this issue matter? Why are we talking about affordable access? Why should anyone care? And for us, it's ultimately about what's described in this chart. What you see here is that price of 1 gigabyte as a percentage of someone's average monthly income as summarized across those 100 countries which we follow. And as you'll see, the dotted black line there towards the bottom is what is the international standard for affordability, known as 1 for 2. That is that 1 gigabyte of mobile data shouldn't cost someone more than 2% of their income. And as you'll see, the only region that reaches that target consistently is Asia. And even within that region, there are countries that haven't met that target. But in the Americas, in Africa, and across the spectrum of the 100 countries, the averages go above that marker and really indicate how unaffordable data is for a number of people, with some of the worst cases going up into the 20s in terms of fractions of what someone's income, in terms of the fraction of someone's monthly income it would take to buy 1 gig of data, which we consider to be entry-level broadband. And so when we're thinking about how do we solve this, it came down for us into three succinct messages of you need to have competitive markets for mobile broadband, You need to have affordable backhaul and infrastructure to support that market. And then you also need to make sure that public access and community networks are supported within the policy environment within a country to really fill out any gaps that remain. And so at the heart of the Affordability Report is the Affordability Drivers Index, and that is a broad composite measure of how different countries have set up their policy environments and regulatory spaces for telecommunications, each of those policies having a positive relationship with driving down the price of internet access. And so what we see here is a summary of a point that we see every year, but it's good to see reliably that countries that perform really well on the Affordability Drivers Index, that is, that they sit further to the right-hand side of this chart, also see lower prices overall in the market, which is that they sit lower on the chart rather than higher. And that is also the inverse, that countries that aren't performing so well on the index, that is, that their policy environments aren't so welcoming, they are having higher prices for 1 gigabyte of data. This is a quick table that summarizes some of the key positions across the Affordability Drivers Index this year. So the top 10 countries, again, features Malaysia, Colombia as the top 2. They've been there for a few years now. There's strong representation from Latin American countries and some Asian countries as well. We also, because income plays such an important factor in a country's ability to perform well on this index, we do also specifically isolate just the low-income countries as well. In that table, Benin, Rwanda, and Tanzania all perform really well. But also importantly, we wanted to look at what countries are doing particularly well, who moved a lot from last year's index to this year's index. Unfortunately, we see Cameroon and Mali did quite well, and that's with the introduction of new national broadband plans, which help kind of provide a lot of stability and long-term vision to a country's market, but also some pro-consumer policy changes. For example, in China, it's the introduction of mobile number portability, which is the process by which a user can keep their phone number and still change which operator they use for their data, which has been seen to kind of enable consumers to move more easily between operators and really leverage the benefits of a competitive market to their advantage. Now, the Affordability Drivers Index is quite complex, and we don't need to go into detail about each of these features within it. The one thing I did want to point out is that market competition is, in its own right, one of the indicators that we use to assess a country in this index, which is that box in blue. But also you see a number of boxes in orange, which are policy indicators that have a very tangible impact on market competition. So for example, we have mobile number portability, which we just talked about in China, but also, for example, licensing frameworks. If a country has a more permissive and open licensing framework that encourages people to provide internet services, you're typically going to have greater competition and a more vibrant telecommunications sector. At the inverse, if that licensing framework is more closed and restricted, you're not going to have as many providers and therefore less competition. And this turns us to the point of competition overall in the world. And this gives us a quick layout of what competition looks like across the globe. So you'll see countries fit into one of 4 baskets, depending on how many major operators are in that market, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and they're color-coded this way. So you'll notice some countries do indeed only have 1 major operator. Unfortunately, a number of those countries are found in Africa, but there is some positive news. For example, Ethiopia is looking to expand out that network, expand their market into the introduction of new players. Whereas in areas like Latin America, you do see a lot of robust competition with Chile, Peru, and Brazil, all 3 having 4 different operators providing telecommunication services in those countries. And so there is quite a wide spectrum. And so in many ways, there's no one-size-fits-all, but there is an important point to be made across the globe that encourages competition in any geography where it's possible. And so when we're thinking about competition, we really emphasize to policymakers and regulators 3 key steps along that process. And they are kind of steps that lead one into the other, because completing the first 2 really enable the third one to happen. The first one is focusing on fair market rules. And so that's things like that licensing framework that we were talking about earlier that really provides certainty and clarity to the market of what's allowed, what's not allowed, how does something work, how does something not work. And with that, it's much more easier for operators and service providers to plan longer-term visions for their investments and for their business plans, which in turn allows for greater investment to be made. That second step is evidence-based policies. So it's making sure that the process of policy change in the country is inclusive and informed by good evidence and data. So it's consulting all stakeholders, so making sure that operators are allowed to provide in data to that process. Civil society voices are also heard in determining what priorities really matter in terms of telecommunications policy. And then lastly, with those first 2 steps, it goes into the question of a dynamic competition policy. And in a lot of ways, you want to think about this in terms of the temperature in a room. You don't want it to be too hot, because if a market is too hot, it's unsustainable, and it's really hard to build a convincing business model in such a market. But at the other end, you don't want a room or a market that's too cold. In those instances, an operator or operators with a particularly dominant or favorable position can just sit there and enjoy their position without actually creating that dynamic pressure that can motivate innovation and create opportunities for consumers to really find advantages for themselves in the market. But sometimes those policy decisions within competition policy can be particularly difficult and particularly political. And so that's why it's important to think about the first 2 steps as kind of building trust and inclusion and good relationships through the sector, so that when those decisions need to be made at that third step, they're taken with confidence and appreciated by everyone within the sector, so that they genuinely stick. It's not a give and take or a tentative decision that's made there. And so yeah, so that gives us an idea of how the markets work, how competition works. But importantly for us, competition doesn't just exist at that retail level of which operator is someone buying their data from. Competition exists in all parts of the network. And for us, we really understand the internet as fitting into 3 parts. You have the first mile, which is also known as backhaul, and those are the submarine cables and the big cables that connect continents and between countries. You have the middle mile, which is connected to that first mile, and each of those networks kind of builds around key institutions within a country and connects different towns within each other. And then lastly, you have the last mile of the network, which connects into the middle mile. And that last mile are the networks you see in a neighborhood or the connection between someone's tower and their mobile phone. But it's important to make sure that there is competition at each level of this part of the network, because we saw, as an example, in Ghana, there was a lack of competition in that first mile because there was a couple decades ago, because there was only one submarine cable that went into the country to provide international connectivity. And because of that limitation, prices at the user end then were inflated through the network, and kind of that consequent effect, because there was a lack of competition at what can be a part that most users aren't going to see, but has an impact on what price they're going to pay. So that's why it's really important to think about those different layers. And many countries are thinking about those different layers. Within this year's report, we do a quick summary of different different investment strategies by different countries. And in particular, we look at what are known as wholesale open access networks. And here are the 5 countries that we look at in greater detail. Wholesale open access networks are essentially backbone networks or backhaul networks, that first mile, that provide then other service providers and operators to buy in access at a wholesale rate, so a fair and equitable rate. into that network. The networks in Mexico and Rwanda are the most developed, and therefore they get the most attention in the report. But there is also something said about the other 3 proposals and their current status. And it's important, what we understood through this project is these projects are really big, so they need a lot of time to be understood how they affect a market. They need a lot of political will and support to be carried out across the years, and they also need a lot of money. But building out the network can be expensive no matter how you do it. It's, trying to understand which ways make it more affordable in each circumstance. But also talking about layers, one of the things we wanted to talk about is that combination of how do you fund it and how does it get funded across each part of the network. And so this chart is probably my favorite chart within the entire report, because you have those different layers of the network that you see across the top of the first mile, the middle mile, the last mile, but also down through the chart, you see different sources of capital investment. So you see private investment, for example, through businesses, through network operators, through companies that operate those cables or operate internet exchange points at that first mile level. But you also see public and government investment in terms of how they invest through their national broadband plans, with the example of wholesale open access networks as a potential option for that. But also quite importantly, that last mile box of public access and universal service and access funds, which does play an important part and which we'll get into more detail in just a second. But also there's a space for community networks, that last row that you see there in blue. And so for us, in trying to understand, how do we build markets? How do we build competitive markets? And how do we do that across the layers? For us, the healthiest markets are ones that create a policy environment that supports each of these squares. So that no matter where you are in the network, there's an opportunity for competitive pressures to be effectively applied, for innovation to happen, and for consumers to be able to leverage a benefit for themselves. And so just moving on to that last part, I did mention we want to talk about public access. Within this report, we have a number of impact stories that connect what can be quite high-level policy issues to how they tangibly impact individuals' lives. And so this is an image that pairs with the story of Grace, who is a cleaner at the University of Cape Town. And so through the university's public access Wi-Fi, she and her daughter are able to access the internet and use much more data for educational purposes, for staying in touch with family, than they otherwise would be if they didn't have this access opportunity. And so the impact stories are really compelling ways of understanding these issues and why what can be complex charts or numbers do ultimately have a very tangible impact on how much money someone has to hand over when they're buying the data that they use. But for us, to focus on that public access part, public access played 2 key roles in broadband markets and why they really need to be prioritized by policymakers. That first one is that they help expand the overall broadband market because they, public access points typically have to buy wholesale bandwidth purchases to private networks. So if you think of an internet cafe, that internet cafe probably needs to buy in a large subscription or a larger subscription to a network operator for that connectivity. And then through that process, it essentially pools together an entire community's data needs, where each of those individual users might not be able to buy a subscription and afford that subscription. So it's bringing those people into the market in a way they might otherwise be excluded. And at the other end, through that process of bringing people in for the first time, it can help stimulate demand within the market. So through onboarding and skill building of first-time users who get to use the internet, get to know it, and then realize the instances in which it can be helpful in their lives, some users can transition from being first-time occasional users into more regular users who do see the benefit and the desire to purchase a private subscription of their own. And so those are examples of how public access matters to the broadband market, but there's also a number of benefits of public access beyond that market. And kind of across a country's entire economy, but also a number of social benefits. Those social benefits being listed here in blue of education and healthcare, so e-health and access to more educational material online, but also digital inclusion. So through public access projects, certain constituencies, certain groups of people who aren't considered priorities, for example, women or rural communities, can gain additional access at an affordable level through public access projects. But there are also these economic benefits of e-commerce and entrepreneurship to grow the economy, mobile money and e-finance to aid financial regulation, remittances to enable families to stay in touch with each other and support each other across large distances, and then also co-location with private businesses, which is just to make the point of, think about the number of cafes or restaurants or stores that provide Wi-Fi and the complementary benefit that public access through that Wi-Fi connection provides both to the business and to the user. And so those are some of the examples of how public access really does matter for countries and why it needs to be a core pillar within an overall strategy for policymakers. And so for us, if we were trying to summarize what is that overall strategy, it really fits into three parts here. It's that first part of making sure you have a competitive market for mobile broadband that allows consumers to choose and be able to use that choice to their advantage. It's affordable backhaul and infrastructure. So for example, thinking about across those different layers, making sure that there's affordable access to the cables and the interchange points that allow operators and smaller service providers provide affordable services to their end users in the retail level. But then also thinking about diverse connectivity strategies and public access. The healthiest and most affordable markets really did amplify this, not just competitive market, but a diverse market that saw multiple sources of different funding supporting the means of affordable access across a country. And so that summarizes the affordability report this year. I'd be happy to take any questions. Do feel free to start writing them in the chat box. But what we'll do first is I will also give a quick demonstration and walkthrough of the Data Explorer that we have on the website. And that gives you an example of how that works and how you can use it to your advantage. So if you wanted to see it, the easiest way to do it is if you go to our website, a4ai.org/affordability-report. You'll come up to this page. You'll see a big blue box that says Explore the Data here. So you click through, and it loads for you. It'll take a second to load. And so you see this big map of how the world looks. And so the countries that you see colored in any shade of blue are the countries that we cover within the Affordability Drivers Index. So as I mentioned before, we only cover 61. It doesn't cover every country in the world. But you can see more information about each year in the Affordability Drivers Index here. So for example, if we go to Nigeria, you can open up and see a small portal summarizing the key information for that country. You can see the country's overall performance on the Affordability Drivers Index, its position out of the 61 countries we cover, and also performance in the access subindex and the infrastructure subindex. These two pieces both feed into the overall score of a country. But you can also click here on Select an Indicator and find out specific information that is available about that market. So for example, we can look at the quality of the licensing frameworks in Nigeria. And so you click Go, and that gives you the numeric score that we ranked out of 10 for that indicator. And you can pair that with how do other countries perform. So if we look at Ghana, for example, you can put that together. So you'll see here that Nigeria performs slightly better in terms of its licensing framework than Ghana does. You can see the overall performance of the two countries here. their overall performance in the Affordability Drivers Index and each of those sub-indices as well. And you can do that for any of these most any of these indicators to pull in information about how that works. And it'll load like that and give you more information. In addition, so that's the country view. In addition, you can do that here at the map view. So if I have the number of people using the internet, you can load at the global level. We have already done that. And it'll give you, it'll change the colors of the map depending on performance on that indicator. So we'll change it just so you see it. So you see there that the colors change depending on which countries do particularly well. And you have a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that do well on this indicator around their national broadband plan, and other countries in light that don't do so well. You can also look back at previous years of the data. So we have 4 years that are available publicly, which are the 4 editions that we have of the report. And you can do this for the overall drive, the index, each of the sub-indexes, and any of these indicators that you see here. So that gives you a rough idea of the Data Explorer. Happy to answer any questions that you may have